Greetings in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and welcome to Recovery in Christ Ministry series on reaching out to a hurting world. Today we're going to get right into talking about the steps and where they came from and what the steps are. They're just a step-by-step process on how to go through the healing and spiritual growth. It's a step-by-step moving from being in control of our own lives, of letting God be in control of our lives. I just want to really talk about where they came from. The steps really came from the Bible, of course. They originated first used in some official way in recovery in the Oxford Group, which was a first century Christian fellowship. And there they had 5 steps. A couple of the guys got involved with it, in the early days of AA, and they took those 5 steps and they cut them up and they dissected them into 12. Bill Wilson was really the personal author of that, hopefully led by the Holy Spirit. And what he did is he stopped at 12 because there are 12 apostles. And you could have dissected them even further, but the principles remain the same. And the 5 steps back then were: 1, admitting that you got a problem; 2, sharing honestly with another; and 3, making amends for the harm that is done; and 4, going out and helping others, with the same kind of a problem. And the 5th was asking God to help, with those 4 things. So it's a step-by-step process of healing and spiritual growth. We find that the problem isn't really alcohol or drugs or what we consider to be a life-controlling problem. The problem is really that we're approaching life the wrong way, that we're in control of our own lives and carrying out our own plan. So it's learning how to move from being in control and self-centered to God being control and God-centered. And we're not alone in doing that. We can get a sponsor. A sponsor is someone in recovery that's gone ahead of us, that's worked the steps, and has a successful program in recovery and is willing to help us along the way. It's kind of like dropping into a jungle and a guide coming up and saying, "Hey, I know that these paths, and I can direct you to safety. You want me to guide you to safety?" And of course, hopefully we would say yes. And that's kind of like what a sponsor is. And the other thing is that God is with you. You don't have to do it alone. Joshua 1:9 says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." God is with us, and we don't have to do it alone. Let's just get right into step 1. Step 1 says that we admit that we're powerless over our dependencies and that our lives have become unmanageable. It's really the end of denial. Is the beginning of recovery, as we say. And the joke is in recovery is denial is not a river in Egypt. It's admitting that we have a problem. It's coming to that point of brokenness, coming to the end of ourselves, where we say we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. We've hit bottom. We've had enough pain, and admitting that we can't handle things is hard for a lot of people. It goes against everything that we've been taught. It goes against our pride. It goes against our ego, but in order to start getting better, we have to take this step and call out for help and admit that, hey, I can't handle it, my life is unmanageable, and that I'm powerless over my dependencies. And Romans 5:6 says, "You see that at just the right time, when we are still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." We're not able to save ourselves, and we're not able to heal ourselves, and we're not able to change ourselves. But God can and will do for us what we can't do for ourselves. And this step, it forces us to admit that we can't manage our own lives. And there's a biblical example of that in the Bible. And it's in Luke 15:11 through 31 of the prodigal son, where he had asked for his inheritance from his father. He took his portion of that, and he went into a faraway city. And he spent his money on riotous living. That had to be one of the first addicts in the Bible, and first alcoholics, because he lost everything that he had. He hit bottom. He ended up eating with the pigs, and he was hungry, and he longed to eat what the pigs had to eat. And he said something like, if I could only return to my father, his hired hands, has plenty to eat. And he did return to the father, and the father saw him when he was a far way off, when he was a long way off, and he didn't wait for him to come to him. The father ran after him. He hugged him, he embraced him, he loved him, and he restored him. And even threw a party for him. He restored him to sonship. And the prodigal son thought that maybe he would have to be relegated to a hired hand position, but that was not the case. He put the royal robe on him and a ring of sonship on his finger. And that's what God does to us. When we turn toward him, he restores us and he loves us. And we find out that that Jesus is faithful to us today. The reason that these steps work is not because they are invented by some man or some woman, by some human being. They work because Jesus Christ is still in the business of healing and transforming lives today. Now let's listen to what some of the other recovery leaders have to say about this step. And today we have with us Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller, that's not the big band leader actually, but he does sing and play a musical instrument. He is a pastor, the pastor of Solid Rock Ministries. Glenn has been recovering himself for over 17 years. He has one of the largest Christian residential programs in the country with 184 beds, for both men and women. And they really do recovery right over there. Pastor Glenn is also the president of Christian Recovery Network. I've got a chance to work with him over the years in the Bay Area here, and I just have the highest regard for him and the way they do recovery. Pastor, we're glad to have you with us today.
It's an honor to be here, Richard.
Pastor, would you share with us your favorite scripture verse, please?
That would have to be John 8:36. When the Son of God sets you free, you're free indeed, because that's been the experience that I have received in my life.
Pastor Glenn, would you share with us on step 1, please?
That is so important to me to understand today that that step brought me to finally a point of understanding that it wasn't everybody else's problem, it was mine. And when I understood that I was powerless in my life over not only alcohol but people, places, and things, I had the ability then to start doing something about it. And it was difficult for me because I was 42 years old when I finally realized that I had a problem. I'd been told for years and years and years that I had a problem, but I never heard it. And at 42 years old, quite honestly, with a pistol in my mouth with the hammer cocked, I was introduced to the solution to that powerlessness. And everybody talks about taking the steps. I don't think that I ever took any of the steps. I think the steps took me. God did for me what I couldn't do for myself, and the first thing was to show me my wicked ways and show me the mess that I've made out of my life. Mm-hmm. The divorces, the abandoned children, everything that everybody else does. I was able to get in touch with that. I was able to see it, and it was probably the most profound experience that I've ever had in my life, because as God illuminated my powerlessness, He also made Himself real for me.
Tricia, would you share with us on step 1, please?
Thank you. Step 1, we admitted we were powerless over our separation from God, that our lives had become unmanageable. When I came into, I actually came into AA 26 years ago, and I didn't even know my life was unmanageable. I just knew that I couldn't live with the pain I was in anymore. And when I admitted that my life was powerless, well, it was difficult to admit my life was powerless because I didn't feel I had any power. It was just totally out of control. And when I came into AA, I learned that I was truly a controlling person, and that God was setting me free from the power that I had in such a negative way. He was leading me into understanding that by admitting that I was powerless and that Jesus Christ did have the power and not me, I was able to let it go and give it to Him, and was able to step out from trying to manage things I couldn't manage, trying to control people I couldn't control, trying to get into situations that I had no business being in. But I learned to step back and let God do it, and to pray and to give it to God and to let go.
Step one, we admitted we were powerless over our disease and our life had become unmanageable. Some people say we're powerless over our addiction and our lives have become unmanageable. But what that step means to me is the first time I was able to get honest with who and what I had become as a result of my drinking and drugging and fornication and all those things. And then I came to an acceptance that it was true, that I had been beaten, that I was powerless, that my life was unmanageable. But a big part of step one for myself was looking at the powerlessness. I really resisted the fact that I had been beaten by an inanimate object, a liquid, a powder, or a solid, or a leaf. I had a trouble with that, but when I backed into that step and I looked at the unmanageability, I had walked away from my job, my career. I was facing 6 5-year sentences for sales and possession. I was $10,000 in back child support payments, and all of the money that I got went to drinking and drugging, and I wasn't taking care of my personal responsibilities. Once I looked at the unmanageability and I was doing it against my will, then I could back into the fact that I had been beaten and I was powerless. And that took a lot of rigorous honesty and soul searching to get to that point. So step one to me, the spiritual principle that I've embraced there, is self-honesty and self-acceptance.
George, would you share with us on step one, please?
Sure, Richard. And I know you want me to be brief, and I'll get right to the point. And I'm brief with people who come into our recovery centers at the two Salvation Armies, one in St. Pete and one in Tampa. I sit down and we'll do a psychosocial evaluation with them. And the question I'll ask, and sometimes these people have been in recovery for 20 years, but they've been active in AA. And I'll ask them a question, and I'll say, do you have a choice about your drinking and your drug? And they'll say, yeah, of course I have a choice. I said, well, you've been in AA for quite a while. You've been amongst with active in AA. You know the AA Big Book pretty good. I said, you know what it says on page 24? On page 24 in italics in the Big Book, it says the alcoholic has lost the ability to make correct choices when it comes to alcohol. His so-called willpower seems practically non-existent, and he's unable at certain times to bring to his consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of only a week or a month ago. He's without defense against the first drink, Richard, and this is the thing that people don't understand. Our culture is very free will, self-will oriented. It's Cartesian in its philosophy, it's existential, and even the churches have gone this same way into modern thinking, that I'm the thinker and I'm the chooser. I'm the captain of my fate and the master of my soul. And thank God for a man having a drug addiction, because it brings him to a place where he begins to realize that inside himself he has no power to control his life. In fact, he begins to understand something, that he's a slave of sin. The Big Book says, instead of sin, it says he's in bondage to himself. And he has to get rid of self or it kills him. And so the 12-step process is a process of applying the crucified life message that Bob and Bill got from Frank Buckman, who got a real good dose of it. And they got broken and humbled and began to understand this life of Christ-centered recovery.
Marcia, would you share with us on step one, please?
The thing that I like the most about step one is the fact that I didn't have a problem admitting that I was powerless. You know, I came in just so beaten and so tired, and my life was so unmanageable that I remember just thinking, there has got got to be something better to life than doing what I had been doing for the past 12 years. And so I'm really, it wasn't hard for me as if a lot of times I hear people share, it took a long time to come in. When it was my time, I knew it was my time, and I came in and just, totally surrendered my life. And I'm so glad that I felt the presence of God during that time, because I was truly, without Him for a long time. And what I have come to realize is that it was just a total unmanageability time in my life. Having to start all over again. Once you have lost everything, once you have given up most of everything that you ever valued, and it goes back as far as even, what you believed in, the way you were raised. When all of that is gone and there is nothing left, I remember just being at the end of my road and wondering how I had gotten there. Prisons, jails, probation, parole, all that came with that. It took all of that for me to finally get the understanding of knowing that I was just totally powerless over my life and how things had become.
Yes, step one. Step one is the easiest step in recovery, and it's also the hardest step. For me, it was the reason it was difficult is I had to admit that my life was out of order and I was out of control. Once I was able to do that, then it became easy that I knew that I needed help. I know when I'd reached the end of myself, and I remember the night very clearly. I was sitting in a bar, and I said to myself, that I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, and there's got to be more to life than this. And I didn't realize it at the time, that was actually a prayer to God. Mm-hmm. And when I'd said that, it was rather strange how God works through others. There was a friend of mine who was drunker than I was when I told him this, and he said, well, I'm not ready for recovery, but I do have some friends that are, and maybe you need to talk to them. And the next thing I know that I'm on the phone with somebody, and the next evening I went to my first recovery meeting, and I started the process. And it was bumpy at first, but the reality that it was hard for me to admit that my life was unmanageable. I had no problem admitting that, for me, being an alcoholic, that I had a problem with alcohol. But it was difficult to come to the end of myself that everything else in my life was unmanageable too. And I had to start, as all of you will have. The first thing is to deal with the addiction, and then God will work with you to deal with the unmanageability. I've been in recovery for 23 years, and I have to admit I've not arrived yet. But my life is, I tend to feel a lot better today than it was when I first started. But the hardest part is the beginning, taking the first step. And then, but once you take that first step, you're taking a step, you have motion, and you're moving towards the Lord, and He will do the rest. All He's looking for is you to get a little momentum, and He will push you through.
Step one is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. For me, it was a little bit more than alcohol. It was powerless over my addiction. When I got sober in 1977, I had been drinking heavily, and I was also using IV heroin for a number of years. And when I was 24 years old, the drug had really taken me down to a point where I'd gone from, a middle-class Chicago, nice ethnic family to living in the streets and living in the ghetto and in and out of jail and a very long arrest record, etc. I mean, not unlike many heroin addicts. I fit the stereotype of a street junkie. And I was arrested when I was 24 years old and charged with felonies, and there was an intervention that took place that I didn't have very much to do with, but I was given an opportunity to go to a rehab center instead of prison. And I was I was a heroin addict, but I wasn't stupid. So, you know, I opted for rehab. The rehab center was 16 months, and during that time I was exposed to the 12-step fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And at that time we didn't have Narcotics Anonymous in this area. But through that I grasped hold of something that was really important to me, and it was the spirituality behind the steps, kind of the underpinnings of the steps. Mm-hmm. You know, I understood the first step. I was powerless. I didn't think, I thought that was kind of a no-brainer, you know, so I never really paid too close of attention to the first step. And, you know, I went along my way and, you know, went to meetings and had a sponsor, and, you know, I did well in recovery. I got myself in college and, you know, earned a master's degree and, you know, started practicing in this profession early back in 1980, actually. But the one thing it seemed to be missing, and I didn't know it at the time, was kind of centered around the first step, you know. And they always say that that's the one step that you have to work perfectly. You know, you really need to get that. And for some reason, I don't think I really got that. And as I continued along in my practice and, you know, all the blessings of recovery, everything that God bestowed upon me, I mismanaged, you know. For some reason, I was not able to handle the success, handle the money. You know, there was a certain amount of prestige with the kind of work I did, and you know, I had some opportunities that were given to me to work with, you know, professional athletes and really high-profile kind of work up in Carolina. And I lost probably the most important part of my recovery at that time, and that was my sense of humility. You know, I went from being so grateful to have come from being a heroin addict living in the ghetto with a criminal record to being a respected professional with a home and friends and, you know, a wardrobe and things like that. Instead of gratitude for that, I soon came to believe that I really was the one who had something to do with all those things happening. You know?
Yes.
And as things came my way, I wondered why there wasn't more. And, you know, if I had X amount of dollars in the bank, I thought, well, you know, other people have more, and that should be me. You know, and I kind of lost the focus of the spiritual components to this step of what the program is all about. And, you know, with powerlessness, that was what I didn't get, you know. I never really fully understood, even though I was a chemical dependency professional and respected in the field. I had a doctorate by this time in psychology. I practiced addiction psychology. I've worked with thousands of people who were addicts, and a lot of them got into recovery. I didn't know what this disease was. I mean, I thought I did. But I really never knew what it was that I had. I didn't know what addiction was. I thought really it was just about not using the drugs, and never really realized that addiction is really a brain disorder that left to its own devices, my brain will eventually convince me that using drugs is a good idea. Mm-hmm. I didn't see it happening. It was, you know, slowly over a long period of time, the erosion of my recovery took place, you know, probably 5 years before I actually got myself in trouble again. But by 1998, which is a little bit over 20 years in recovery, I was angry, I was depressed, I was anxious, I was working an enormous amount of hours. I didn't go to meetings. I didn't really think that anybody could tell me anything anymore that would be helpful to me. I no longer talked to anybody about my own issues, you know, and the only person at that time guiding me in recovery was me. And the real scary part about that was I wasn't that healthy anymore, you know, so I really had a fool for a sponsor. And in 1998, it seemed like a good idea for me to use drugs, and I did. And that set off a relapse that took me, you know, about 3 years to get back into recovery. This time, as I look at the first step, you know, that's something I look at every day. what it is that I'm here for today to take care of is my addiction. And I think hopefully I have a better handle on that today.
Step one for me was a critical step because I'd been around the rooms of recovery for a number of years and never could seem to make any real progress. And I might do well for a little while and then I'd go back to my old behaviors. I always thought that I had done step one correctly, but I'd never really done it correctly. And what I found out this time around was God opened my eyes to see that in the recovery literature it says that there's one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. And I saw at that point when I heard that is the fact that if God has all power, how much power does that leave me? And that leaves me no power.
Amen.
And so I had really never seen that before. And what I had always held on to in the past was I thought I had the power of choice over that first drug or drink. And as long as I maintained that power, I was doomed. And I would always go back out and do what I did before. And I completely surrendered that power at that point and said, okay, Lord, I don't have any power over this thing. I don't have the power of choice even. And unless you do this for me, it's not going to occur. And so I approached powerlessness in that fashion and came to find out later on by reading more recovery literature that other people had come to that conclusion before I did. And so it was nothing novel or unique. It was just something that had been an existing truth all along. The unmanageability part of step one, I never really had a problem with. I was at the point of no return. There was really nothing left to lose for me. And I saw that my plan hadn't worked, wasn't working now, and was never going to work.
Amen.
And by realizing that, I saw my life was unmanageable. So that wasn't a big deal for me. The only other thing that really helped me with step one to get through it and helped me see all this was the fact that I had a friend of mine, and we challenged each other to come up with some examples of powerlessness and unmanageability, and we put those things on paper, and then we shared those together with each other. And as we did that, there was a sort of healing that began to take place. I will say this, when I got done with my step one, I realized that there was no human power in this world that was going to relieve me of my alcoholism or addiction. And that was pretty disconcerting. That was kind of scary, because if there was no human power that was going to do this, I was in pretty bad shape. And if there had not been more steps to follow, I probably would have just taken a gun out and ended it right there, because I didn't have a very rosy future ahead of me. It looked pretty bleak when I got done with step one, but thank God there was more to come.